Good afternoon. My name is Sophie Renaud-Leroy, and I'm the director of the Institute for Globalization Studies at Stony Brook University in the College of Arts and Sciences. Welcome to our second event of the season, Compendium of the World, Colonial Manila and Early Modern World Making, with our distinguished guest, Dr. Miguel Martínez, Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of Chicago. We started our season's lecture series at the Institute last month with a guest from Yale University, Dr. Valerie Hansen, who presented Globalization in Year 1000 after her recent book, attempting to situate globalization as a phenomenon in the medieval times. As a reminder for those who did not attend the first event, this full series is dedicated to globalization across time and place, which my colleague Rosabelle Ansari and I designed together for our institute. For those who do not know Rosabelle yet, Dr. Ansari is a medievalist specialized in Islamic studies, and she teaches classes on global Islam for the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies and the GLI, the Globalization Studies program. And she also serves as a fellow for our institute, organizing events around globalization and her larger field of studies in the medieval and early modern Middle East and the Mediterranean. Like last month, she'll be moderating the event today since she selected our guest for us. Our mission this fall semester has been to introduce you to a facet of globalization that tends to be overseen, its early modern origins and articulation beyond the West, and today's focus is Colonial Manila. And on this topic of the Philippines, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge something very special that happened on this day today. We all woke up this morning to the news of the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to two journalists, one of them being Maria Ressa from the Philippines and another from Russia. But both have been selected for their respective fight for press freedom in an era of increasing authoritarianism and swirling misinformation in their own countries. They both lead independent news outlets in the Philippines and Russia and are honored for their work to hold leaders to account. Since it went live in January 2012, Rappler, the website co-founded by Maria Ressa and three other female journalists, has become one of the Philippines' most popular and influential media platforms, mixing reporting with calls for social activism. And to talk about globalization and cross-cultural exchanges, Ressa, 58, is a dual citizen of the Philippines and the United States, where she spent part of her childhood in Toms River, New Jersey. She attended Princeton and returned to the Philippines in 1986 on a Fulbright fellowship as the country was transitioning away from authoritarianism and adopting liberal democratic ideas. In receiving the Nobel Peace Prize on Friday, today, the Philippine journalist Maria Ressa became only the 18th woman to be selected for the award in its 126-year history. And I wanted to pay a special homage to her and a special homage to her fellow Filipinos and activists who are trying to make the world a better place. It is my pleasure now to let my IGS colleague Rosabelle Ansari introduce today's guest, who'll talk about another time for the Philippines, Colonial Manila, and its position as a hub.
Thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. And thank you for bringing to all of our attention the recent news about the Filipino journalist. So I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Miguel Martínez, Associate Professor of Spanish Literature at the University of Chicago. Professor Martínez is a specialist in the cultural and literary history of early modern Iberia and colonial Latin America, as well as a specialist in early form, representing his work as an early form of globalization, something I hope we can talk more about in the Q&A. His first book, published in 2016 with UPenn Press, was called Front Lines: Soldiers Writing in the Early Modern Hispanic World. In this book, Professor Martínez examined Spanish literary practices of soldiers in the Old and New worlds. In addition to numerous articles, this year alone, Professor Martínez has published 2 more books. One is an edition of Catalina de Erauso, Vida y Sucesos de la Monja Alferez, and another book on a revolt, I think, against King Carlos in the year 1520 to 21, titled Comuneros, el Rayo y la Semilla. Today's presentation will draw on Professor Martínez's new project on the literary culture of early colonial Manila in relation to the global Renaissance. Before I hand over to Professor Martínez, I'll just let everybody know that after the talk, I will be inviting our very own Dr. Paul Ferbas, Associate Professor in Hispanic Languages and Literature at Stony Brook University, to offer some comments and initial comments and questions on the talk. Professor Ferbas is also a specialist in Spanish American texts of the colonial period. So with that, I hand over to Professor Martínez. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Rosabel. Let me try to share my screen first, right, to make sure it works. Can you all see it? Yep. Well, thanks, Rosabel, again for your introduction. I really have to thank the Institute for Globalization Studies at Stony Brook. I thank my dear colleague Paul Ferbas for helping with the discussion later as a respondent, and I also want to thank my dear colleague and friend Mohammed Balan, who started this whole thing. I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity. I was talking with a few people before the whole session started that this gave me the opportunity to actually reconnect with a project that has been long in the making, but that was a little detoured, I would say, maybe because of this other work in the last couple of years that Rosabel was mentioning. So this was really, for me, this was really a great opportunity to, as I said, to reconnect with a project that has been in the making probably for 6 or 7 years already. Also, thank you all for showing up. I mean, it's a Friday afternoon, and I bet you had a bunch of Zoom meetings this week alone. So thank you so much for being here. In this presentation, I address an apparently simple question. What did the world look like from Manila in the first decades, century, I would say, of Spanish colonization? Economic historians have long argued that the Spanish settlement of the city, while precarious, closed the circuit of global commerce by linking several continental markets, mainly through the circulation of American bullion and Asian goods. If the relevance of the galleon connecting Acapulco and Manila is difficult to exaggerate, however small in quantitative terms, the role of Imperial Spain in relation to the existing political dynamics of the South China Sea was certainly limited and peripheral. China, which was arguably the ultima ratio of Spain's entire colonial system, will forever remain out of its imperial grasp. As dreams of conquest were soon abandoned, European certainties about the cultural hierarchies of the world's peoples and polities were deeply shaken. So how did the settlement of Manila change the symbolic geographies that had coalesced around the dual structure of the old world and the new world of America? Or around the also dichotomic structure of East and West in the early modern period. My title, Worldmaking, the worldmaking in my title refers to the concept most productively deployed by Aisha Ramachandran, by which she refers to, by which she means the methods by which early modern thinkers sought to imagine, shape, revise, control, and articulate the dimensions of the world. It captures the relentless intellectual and cultural drive to uncover a comprehensive vision of the whole. I found this particularly useful to discuss a few texts from Manila, probably too many, but I wanted to share with you the richness of this corpus at least. And some of those methods had also a lot to do with the European mapping cartographically and discursively that of lands and crucially the seas, right, of the Pacific Basin, which Ricardo Padrón has very recently explored in a book titled The Indies of the Setting Sun, and from which I will also be drawing today, among many other other work by many other colleagues. This is part of a larger book project on which, as I said, I have been working for a while, which I'm currently calling, and it changes every year probably, Third New World, Manila's Literary Culture and the Global Renaissance. And it will certainly change soon. Third and New World, Tercero y Nuevo Mundo, is the way some writers from the period refer to the Philippines and its neighboring regions in Southeast Asia. The phrase, which was bound to stay, and the literature associated with it, entailed a powerful imaginative gesture to name and dominate the archipelagic continuum of the Pacific, from the Marianas to Taiwan, from the Philippines to today's Indonesia. While it seemed to stress the natural continuity of westward colonial expansion from the Americas, as Padrón has studied precisely, and across the ocean, it also revealed the novelty of this third world, its specificity vis-a-vis imperial practice and discourse in Latin America, as well as a certain epistemological rupture in the apprehension of the globe as a coherent meta-geography. Neglected by scholars for a long time, a surprisingly rich and multilingual literary culture emerged in Manila in the first decades after its conquest by Spain, that attempted to symbolically produce this new space. And it's truly a neglected corpus. We were joking, Paul and I were joking before that. We are all late in our Philippine reading, and it's a pretty large corpus, actually, an interesting one, as I hope to show today. Highly original ethnographies, travel narratives, and political treatises partially reshaped the regional cultural dynamics and contributed to reimagine a proliferating globe. This corpus of cultural production from Manila is the object of the book. But the project has evolved significantly, I would say, since I first conceived it. And in what follows, you'll be able to see part of that evolution, because the first part of my talk belongs probably to a previous moment of my thinking about it. And in the second, I will develop some ideas about this, as I said, the progress of the book, right? What started mainly as an inquiry into about world making and the global imagination has progressively become more local and more attuned to the literary rumor and intense cultural tumult of Manila's streets. Colonial Manila was indeed at the center of a third new world of commoners, of a third new world, but it was also a world of commoners and go-betweens, of terceros. For its Spanish-lettered elites, Manila's multiracial third state was a kind of new world wonder. Manila was indeed one of the most diverse cities on earth, according to inhabitants and visitors alike. The language of Góngора's poetics, the traditions of European carnival, or the theatrical codes of the Spanish Comedia served some writers to build a literary culture and a social identity stubbornly urban and metropolitan against the siege of a barely colonized interior that started right at the walls of Intramuros, the fortified European core of the city. But it also gave rise to a kind of popular Baroque embraced by common soldiers, Spanish naturales and mestizos, literate Ladinos, and anonymous craftsmen of mestizo and Chinese descent, for instance, as much as it was by friars, university professors, and judges of the audiencia. Manila's vastly diverse underclasses played a leading role in developing the city's peculiar underground culture, which amounted largely, I think, to the newness of this third new world. So as you see, the project has evolved in the sense of looking at the kind of revernacularization of certain originally Spanish cultural idioms. And as I said, it has become increasingly more local. This is also in the wake, and I hope we can have a discussion about it, in the wake of some very serious critiques of the global turn in the aftermath of the so-called global turn a few years ago, right? So let me start to share with you a few of these texts. The mental map of early modern European thought and imperial practice, the Philippines were far, and remoteness determined to a great extent a very pervasive cartographic discourse about the archipelago. Actually, Guillaume Godin leads a research project on distance as a factor of imperial imagination and administrative practices, actually. An account, or Relación, published in 1636, celebrated the defeat of the Dutch in the Maluku island of Terrenate as a great joy, quote, to see the arms of the King our Lord with the splendor and brightness they deserve, even in the last end of the earth. Los últimos fines de la tierra. You have it on the screen. Using a similar language, Father Francisco Golin deemed the Philippines the last part on the end of the world, if that makes any sense. Lo último de los fines de la tierra. The author of Sagrada Fiesta, a rare theatrical compilation published in the Philippines, also referred to the archipelago as La última tierra del mundo y el mar más oculto, the last end of the world, and which is hidden after at least 2 oceans and over 3,000 leagues of travel. And yet, paradoxically, they are at the center of this third new world of Southeast Asia. According to Colin as well, the same author I quoted the latest, there is nothing else to discover or kingdoms to desire, for the city of Manila in these islands is at the center of all that has been discovered, and where the Great China, Japan, Muscajar, Tonkin, Cochin China, Cambodia, or Siam, and other kingdoms come to trade, protected by your majesty's shelter. Yeah, sorry, there's a discrepancy there with the text. But the reason why Manila can be thought of as the organizing axis of these disparate places is because what we today know as the Philippines were in fact part of a much larger geographical unit, the so-called Archipiélago de San Lázaro. According, for instance, to Antonio de Morga, but this is very present in colonial discourse from the Philippines, this archipelago included the Philippines, yes, but also the Moluccas, places such as Taiwan, the Malay Peninsula, the Mariana Islands in the Pacific, New Guinea, and you name it, right? Of course, the virtue of the archipelago for the imagination of contested territories is that it is a rather loose geographical concept. Whereas coasts, peninsulas, straits, or mountain ranges can be considered hard geographical facts, archipelagos are arguably softer. It is hard to deny that Cuba is an island, but it is considerably easier, however, to conceive of Luzon, Mindanao, the Visayas, together with the Moluccas, New Guinea, Taiwan, etc., as part of a single archipelago. The expansive possibilities of this mega archipelago could eventually prolong it to incorporate the Mariana Islands, or Islas de los Ladrones, as they were known to the Spaniards, or other Pacific islands, emphasizing the Philippines' position as a link, both physical and imaginary, between the New World and the Third and New World to which they were made to belong. Archipelago, said the 18th century Jesuit Murillo Velarde, whom I will be discussing later as well, es un pedazo de mar sembrado de muchas islas. Sorry, I had a good image about the archipelago. Es un pedazo de mar sembrado de muchas islas. It's a piece of sea sown with islands. And I love the way in which land and sea get integrated in that metaphor. The first printed document to tell the story of Miguel López de Legazpi's voyage into the Pacific and the subsequent Spanish settlement in the Philippines was published in Barcelona in 1566. The document has been dismissed by bibliographers and miscatalogued by librarians. According to José Toribio Medina's foundational bibliography of the Philippines, the text offers no knowledge of true historical value. The language is vague, and there is an abundance of lies. Of no interest, sentenced Retana, who's another illustrious bibliographer of the Philippines. The only copy I know of this particular print is at the JCB, John Carter Brown Library, and I have to thank my good friend and colleague, Jorge Mojarro, for helping me clarify the textual history of this print, which is a pamphlet, a two-sheet pamphlet. Despite these observations, which might actually be accurate, the anonymous author emphasized the importance of, quote, the joyous discovery that the Mexicans have made, el venturoso descubrimiento que los mexicanos han hecho, and insisted in telling his interlocutor, a certain Miguel Salvador from Seville, that this is a great achievement of great importance, and those in Mexico are truly happy with their discovery, as they find that they will now be the world's heart, el corazón del mundo. Sorry. Far from being an unreliable document about a well-known expedition, this Pliego de Cordel, this pamphlet, might be the equivalent of Columbus's letter to Sant'Angel, printed in 1493, but it already makes apparent the kind of transformative, right, consequences that the settlement of the Philippines had for the geographical imagination of Renaissance Europe. Mexico will now be the world's heart, el corazón del mundo, after reaching across the Pacific and settling in Cebu. The American continent is suddenly recentered. The populous capital of New Spain is now imagined not as a western pole of the known world, but as the crucial link between two halves of the empire. And this will have interesting consequences if you think of texts, Mexican texts, such as Bernardo de Valbuena's Grandeza Mexicana, for instance. The Jesuit Pedro Chirino started writing the order's Historia de la Provincia de Filipinas well, actually, he mostly finished in 1610, although he kept working on it until his death in 1635. Speaking of the historical progress of the order, Chirino gives narrative structure to historical and geographical contingency. The Jesuit states that after taking care of America, quote, in order to bring the East and the West together, it only remained to settle in the Philippines, which are like the milestone or border of two worlds, the Western and the Eastern. Linde y Mojon, the terms I've clumsily translated as milestone or border, are actually very specific and concrete in the original Spanish. They refer to material practices of state partition and land delimitation, whether we are talking about private property or political territorialities. So when parceling up the world in Spanish imperial discourse, the Philippines become the measure of a new partition of the world. Chirino's text is actually rich in geographical metaphors, and as a textual cartography, it entails a bold, imaginative move. After describing and narrating a spiraling wheel of islands in the Pacific Ocean, the Jesuit situates the Philippines in the middle of everything. So he will basically, can you see my cursor? He will basically go this way to encompass the Pacific in his textual description, and will situate the Philippines at the center. So the English version is actually much shorter and selective from the longer Spanish version that you have in the bottom. God placed them, the Philippines, in the middle of that new world, because going from Peru to California, and then through that large bay of Labrador, and then on the other side, Korea and Japan and China and Cochin China, and then the rest of the kingdoms until Malacca, and from there to all India, and then from Malacca southwards toward the large islands of Sumatra, the Javas, Brunei, Mindanao, and Maluku, and many others in that archipelago, on to New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and finally returning to Peru. The wheel is closed, and in the middle remain the Philippines, with a great multitude of islands and peoples it encompasses, because it seems they aim at every place and they weave together all these remote parts of the West and East Indies. The island chain in Southeast Asia serves to creatively tie or weave together Spain's West Indies and East Indies, a common move in discourse from the period. When the son of Philip IV, Prince Felipe Prospero, was born in Madrid, Manila celebrated, as was usually the case, a few years later. In this account of the urban festivities written by Alonso del Valle and published in Manila in 1666, The city is characterized as the metropolis of the 11,000 Philippine Islands, sovereign of the uncultured Luzon, queen of the vast archipelago of San Lazarus, and empress of its immense circumference. Again, Manila is pinned at the center of an imaginary circle that mirrors and evokes the orbis terrarum, or the Earth's sphere. So from being the center of Southeast Asia, Manila will eventually come to play a crucial role as the symbolic center of a new imagination. An Italian traveler said that 17th century Manila was, quote, so equally situated between the wealthy kingdoms of the East and of the West that it may be accounted as one of the greatest places of trade in the world. Colonial discourse and cultural practices gave the city a place of honor in the new order of the world. In 1677, Miguel Ortiz de Covarrubias, the dean of Manila's cathedral, wrote a panegyric sermon to celebrate St. Francis Xavier, apostle of the Indies. Here's how the prelate represented Manila in the symbolic geography of the Spanish Empire and the world. You have it on the screen. Please receive, Lord, the crown of the widest empire that a king ever had since the foundation of the world, which today celebrates the most noble city of Manila, not the least ornament of this crown, limit and hinge of both worlds, the most illustrious emporium of the Orient, the most venerated frontier of so many daring nations. Clausula means both end and conclusion, but also articulation, hinge, revealing the subtle game of language that allows for the recentering of Manila in the meta-geography of the world. That is, from being the remotest, the last, the closing part of the earth, it became the hinge, the articulation of it all. And more importantly, the language of Covarrubias' sermon also evokes the cartographic imagination of the period. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with this map. This is Vicente Memille's famous map of the Spanish Empire as a gorgeous queen, with metropolitan Spain at its crown, and Philippines actually at her feet. So the text I just quoted literally turns the map on its head. The Philippines are no longer the feet of this anthropomorphic empire, but its crown. So it puts it somehow patas arriba, as we say, right? Other texts seem to have naturalized that metaphor, the hinge metaphor. A letter written in 1632 and aimed at convincing the Spanish king of defending Manila against Portuguese Macau, the key eastern port of the empire, warned against unhinging the Chinese trade from Manila. En desquiciando de aquella ciudad el comercio de la China, no será posible volverla a introducir. That is, if you take out the commerce with China from Manila, it will never go back to it because Macau will have taken over. Quicio is quite literally the hinge of a door. In this case, the door that opens eastern markets for the Spanish Empire. The city of Manila, while small, says the Jesuit Juan de Rivera in 1619, is the main station for the great kingdoms of the East. I save you the list again, which you become accustomed to by now. And this is why it is in the very center of that circumference. In fact, it is precisely the economic interest that populates Manila with people from all kingdoms of the East, of East and Southeast Asia, according to the same Jesuit. This is the quote you have on the screen. Since all nations are motivated by interest and being the profit of these islands as high as can be seen, we are destined to have all the nations here. It's kind of a magnet for all the nations of the world. So here's where I wanted to transition to the second part of my paper, and you will see, and in that transition, I think might give us opportunity for later discussion, because it has to do with this change that the project has been undergoing from this more global perspective to a more localized one. What I have been discussing so far could all belong to what Aisha Ramachandran and Frank Lestrigan called the catastrophic gaze, the displacement of one's point of view upward so as to grasp the entirety of the world. That is, to throw Manila as the hinge between two worlds, or the ultimate knot to tie together a finally round globe, certainly required a view from above, an imaginative leap that brought together history, geography, and poetry. But this is not the only way in which colonial discourse on Manila turned the city into this kind of planetary master key. It also required, and this is what I'm most interested in now, a view from below, a discourse that accounted for the motley crowd of Manila's streets, for the unparalleled ethnic and linguistic diversity of the modern city. So let me share with you a few texts in this regard. Literally from Manila's streets comes the next text I wanted to share with you. It is one of more than 400 poems that were originally written and posted on the streets of Manila for the exequies and funeral processions in honor of Philip III and in celebration of Philip IV's ascension to the throne in 1621. It was collected in 1625 by soldier Diego de Rueda y Mendoza in the work that you see on the screen, which I have worked on quite a bit. This is a great miscellany of texts containing all kinds of, descriptive passages, ethnographic descriptions, sermons, and poems by many different individuals from different constituencies, ethnic and institutional constituencies of the city. And it's truly the first anthology, really, of colonial Philippine poetry. The last stanza of the collection of poetry reads as follows, is what you have on the screen. And since this is poetry, I guess I'll read it in Spanish, and you have the English translation right there. Las gentes y naciones son diversas, diversas sus costumbres y cuidados. Las fortunas son prósperas y adversas, favorables y adversos son los hados. Los japones, los chinas y los persas, y españoles presentes y pasados, nos iguala la muerte según vemos, y en nacer y morir nos parecemos. This may not be egalitarian discourse, what brings together the many different nations that constitute the complexly hierarchical society of the Philippines is, after all, death, right? And nothing else. And yet, the moral commonplaces of Baroque vanitas, right, which conventionally decries worldly life as irrelevant and void as opposed to the truths of eternity, is here embedded in a discourse of ethnic and social heterogeneity that is representative of a particular kind of celebratory, epidictic imperial discourse. And this becomes a kind of standard discursive move for many texts written in the Philippines. This is by by the Franciscan Bartolomé de Letona in 1662. He observed, as you have on the screen, the variety of nations that one can see in Manila and its surroundings is the greatest in the world. Because you can find there men from all kingdoms and nations of Spain, France, England, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Poland, Moscovia, from everywhere in the East and the West Indies, Turks, Greeks, Moors, Persians, Tartars, Chinese, Japanese, Africans, and Asians. And there are men here from kingdoms, provinces, and nations of the four parts of the world. This is a little later, and as you can see, I'm not following a chronological order. This is a little later text, also quite rare, from 1729 and written by Pedro Murillo Velarde, whom I will be discussing pretty much until the end of my talk. The Jesuits of Manila in this year, 1729, led the public celebrations for the canonization of San Stanislao Kotska and San Luis Gonzaga, both of them members of the company. In a series of narrative octavas that describe the festivities, Pedro Murillo Velarde vividly described the tumultuous crowd of the city festival. De nobles, de lucidos ciudadanos, numeroso el concurso se señala, atentos, obsequiosos, cortesanos, del garbo hacen alarde y de la gala, a venerar los héroes soberanos, popular muchedumbre se intercala. En ondas se conmueve tanta gente que parecía un piélago viviente. And I love those two last lines. So many people swirled around that it seemed a living ocean. Living ocean, or piélago viviente, resonates with other texts that troped together in one metaphorical stroke, so to speak, the archipelago's ethnic diversity, its abundant population, and its insular geography. Murillo Velarde's powerful image is an exact inversion, a perfect chiasmus of a poem written by Francisco de Alcina, also a Jesuit, that accompanied his outstanding ethnographic encyclopedia of the Visayas, sub-archipelago within the Philippines, Historia de las Indias e Indios Visayas, a text that Murillo Velarde had actually used for the writing of his own Historia. And I placed three different texts on the screen because I will be referring to all of them, and I think it may be, I think there's a dialogue between them, so I thought it might be useful. In that text, Alcina had offered a packed cornucopia of sea creatures, among whom he included, and this is the second text on the screen, he included a vulgo inmenso que en sí te se encierra de más plebeyos peces y menudo, an immense mass of small and plebeian fish. When compared to the whales, turtles, and big sea creatures in general, he incorporated into his marine catalog, the rest of the fish are just like the thronged ranks of the city's plebeian masses, vulgo. And this is why I said that it is a perfect chiasmus, right? Because for Alcina, the depths of the sea are populated by human-like masses of small common fish, while for Murillo Velarde, the human crowds of the city make it look like a living ocean. The language that structures the apprehension of Manila's social fabric intersects with the poetic language to name the natural world of Manila's archipelagic geography. The streets, the sea, and the islands can all equally shelter God's offspring, a powerful image of the varietas of the world's creation. No, I'm sorry. In a previous history of the Company of Jesus, written in 1663, Francisco Colín had referred to the archipelago itself as a thick and swarming crowd of islands, numerosa y espesa muchedumbre de estas islas. That is an anthropologizing trope. Muchedumbre is only used for people normally. That turns the very isles into a human mass. And of course, the image of evangelization as a spiritual fishery of souls, pesquería de almas, was ubiquitous in missionary discourse. Again, islands proliferate as a mirror image of the human crowd that flocks to Manila from all parts of the planet, a planet that was, after all, an impossible water world dotted by fragmentary landscapes. I took this felicitous formulation from Ricardo Padrón, who was using it precisely to talk about Pigafetta's account of the first circumnavigation of the globe. Let me quickly go back to another stanza in Murillo Velarde's poem. The waves of people crowding the streets include both noble vecinos and a multiracial popular multitude, as we saw. And there's, as again, as has become already standard by now, people from all kinds of origins and national and ethnic backgrounds. Hay en Manila persas, malabares, etíopes, armenios, holandeses, mindanaos, ternates, macasares, de América españoles, portugueses, chinos, bengalas, tártaros, lescares, mogoles, africanos y franceses. Aqueste, pues, concurso sin segundo, es compendio feliz de todo el mundo. This unmatched concurrence is the perfect collection of the entire world, and this is where I took my title from. Compendio feliz de todo el mundo, curat, as the perfect motto of the city, in the social and geographical imagination of Manila's lettered elites. It could be engraved on the city's coat of arms, or hanged in Intramuros Puerta Real. It encapsulates very graphically many of the ideas Manileños, elite Manileños, had in the late 17th and 18th centuries about their city as a global cosmopolitan emporium, but also as a picturesque locale of orderly, subjugated diversity. For its lettered elites, Manila's human diversity was, as I suggested, a third New World wonder. In Manila, the walls of the lettered city, following Ángel Rama's influential paradigm, were quite literal, and they regulated access to the European core of the city. A peculiar literary system where a very small number of agents spurred competition among religious orders, municipal institutions, and powerful merchants largely controlled the public display of discourse, such as the verses by Murillo Velarde I just explored in the spaces of the city. Exposed poetry was a way of imposing order in a precariously walled lettered city. As Murillo Velarde's stanzas suggest, however, Intramuros was not impermeable to Manila's heavily populated surrounding towns and neighborhoods. Servants, slaves, workers, litigants, and parishioners did regularly belong in the reduced traza that accommodated Spanish cities and institutions. And during city festivals, and I've quoted from a number of those, sweeping crowds would flock to the streets of Manila's largely European core, multiracial plebeians who vastly outnumbered, of course, Spanish vecinos or citizens, participated in these rituals, and they are kind of co-producers in all the activities that gather these occasions. But they also gave Manila a peculiar urban culture, a soundscape, and a sort of city view. In a heavily segregated city, precariously governed by a very small group of Spaniards, as I said, these kind of festivals, poetic, performative, social, were perhaps more than anything a public occasion for the spectacularization of Manila's diversity, yet richly stratified social body. And I believe that in part, the kind of world-making discourse that we see in the literary production of Colonial Manila has to do with this precisely. The presence in Manila streets of representatives from so many nations acted as a powerful cumulative synecdoche to represent the world, a compendium of the world. And I will end my talk. I don't know how I'm with time, Rosabel.
I mean, up to 5 more minutes, but
5 more minutes. Okay, yeah, that's enough. Thank you. So I think that the last text I'm going to share with you will clarify this last point I made about the importance of this street view, this city view, for the symbolic geographies of the early modern world. It is a moment in the early chapters of Murillo Velarde's Historia de la Compañía de Jesús, not the previous text that I commented on, printed in Manila by famous Tagalog printer and engraver, by the way, Nicolás de la Cruz Bagay in 1749. This is the text. I'm only gonna read it in English, and I'm gonna mostly focus on the highlighted part. I believe there is no other city, he says, in the world where so many nations flock to as this one, Manila. For in addition to the Spaniards, who are the citizens and the owners of the country, and the Tagalog, who are the natives of this land, there are many other Indians from islands with different languages, such as, and he proceeds to list a number of Philippine nations and peoples. There are also criollos, or dark-skinned blacks. He's referring to the Aeta people, also native to the land, as well as many blacks from Angola, Congo, and Africa. He also proceeds to South Asia, and he names a number of geographical regions, if not ethnicities, right, from the Indian subcontinent. There are very many Sangleyes or Chinese, some of them Christian, for the most part Gentile. Then he goes on to include the Moluccas, and then other Asian nations, Armenians, Persians, Tartars, Macedonians, Turks, Greek, and of course, all the nations from Europe and all the nations, or all the people, or people from all the kingdoms in Spain. And I conclude with the last highlighted lines. And thus, if someone goes one afternoon to the Tulay or Bridge of Manila, he will see all these nations passing. He will see their costumes and hear their languages, which cannot be accomplished in any other city in the entire Spanish Empire or the monarchy of Spain, and hardly in any other part of the world. The text insists on some of the ideas that I have been discussing, but it is the image of a viewer contemplating the whole world in one single street in Manila that for me brings the point home. The gaze of that hypothetical observer contrasts with the catastrophic gaze I mentioned before, right? From above, that elaborated those complicated discursive and symbolic geographies, which Manila altered. So this is a street view from below, from a concrete bridge in Manila, a highly localized scene that also allows somehow to grasp the entirety of the world by contemplating the multiplicity and heterogeneity of the city. And here I wanted to make a short reference to the image that Rosabel very appropriately selected for the poster of this talk, which comes from this chest produced in mid-17th century Philippines, which I was able to see. It was until recently in the Museo del Barroco in Puebla in Mexico, but I think it's not there anymore. Anyway, I had the chance to see it a couple of years ago. And as you can see, it's the cover of the chest, right? So you see when you open it, talking about quicios and hinges and clausulas. And here's the bridge he's referring to. This is the Parian, which is the Chinese neighborhood, but I'll give you a better image. It's that, which actually, this, by the way, these beautiful laminas are by Bambrilla in Malaspina's World Expedition, and they are now at the Museo Naval in Madrid. Sorry, that was a detour. So, of course, this way of apprehending and domesticating the bewildering human variety of colonial Manila was entirely functional to Spain's imperial project. This was a dominated, conquered diversity that could only enrich the monarchy, literally and symbolically. But it also reminds me of an argument recently made by Romain Bertrand in a special issue of Past and Present that precisely explored the problems of scale that I guess this is the perfect venue to discuss, right? And particularly the relation between microhistory and global history. He said, bridging the gap between microhistory and global history may not mean moving back and forth between different levels of contextualization, as if reality was a tiered, multi-layered cliff and the historian and adventurous alpinist, but rather in unearthing the fossilized remains of the many worlds that lay intermeshed in one single location. Of course, that's another project, but I think that's where my project is increasingly going, or where I would like it to go. So to conclude, Manila and the discourse produced by its later elites contributed greatly to the intelligibility of a newly globalized world. The poems, sermons, chronicles, and pamphlets written in and about Manila may have had a much more important role than has been recognized in that imaginative struggle to capture the world's entirety, in Ramachandran's words, in that desire to comprehend it and to encompass it and to encapsulate it in one single gaze, in a golpe de ojos, no? O golpe de vista. Manila was a territory of proliferating diversity and dense exchange networks of all kinds, by virtue of being imagined at the center of this more or less coherent and yet changing geography. Manila became first the queen of a vast and rich archipelago of San Lázaro, then the hinge between the new world of the American continent and the old new world of the Far East, the knot tying two halves of the world, and finally, as I have tried to argue, a densely populated compendium of the world's human diversity. Ultimately, colonial discourse produced in the city. Manila becomes the symbolic center of a new world imagined anew. And thank you so much for your patience. I hope I didn't go too much over time. Let me stop sharing.
Wow, thank you, Miguel. That was phenomenal. Round of applause. I'm no literary scholar, but I was really blown away by that. So Thank you. So I'll immediately hand over to Professor Firabas for his comments, reflections, questions.
Thanks so much, Miguel. Fantastic talk. So many things that I would like to sort of briefly comment and then open the table for questions. Well, very impressive mass of concepts, informations, and traditions. I would like to say one of the things that struck me pretty much at the end of your talk when you were reading, I think, was sort of Murillo's description of the market or description of the society as a very multiple nations, is that it reminded me immediately also of early 17th century descriptions of Spain itself in Europe as this sort of nation of nations. So there and this happens in a few, for example, studies of the origins of the Indians, where they are trying to trace pretty much the lost tribes from Israel and that kind of stuff. But then they go seriously into say, well, but listen, Spain is also this and this, and we have these people. So there's also my point is that there's also like an internal way of looking at Spain itself as this sort of within Europe place that was sort of a cul-de-sac, a place where all the nations would sort of get together. And I see that clearly being also now extended into Philippines, that summarizes, and now it's truly global in a way, So this is quite interesting. I also find it very appealing to, actually, I would say, to my own work, that you might be familiar with some of these tensions between the sort of what you call the street view and more like in contemporary terms, we can say more like a satellite view, sort of the cosmographic, geographic, opposed to the local topographic, choreographic view, which you, I think, are working very well. And at the same time, how language, not just the gaze or the view, how language and its metaphors sort of subverts this separation, because when you imagine the empire in terms of sort of domestic imaginary, like spatially, you were talking about hinges and doors, and this is an amazing vocabulary in the 16th, 17th, 18th century on precisely that, the doors of the empires, the hinges, and that fantastic quote on desquiciado, that you this que se desquicia, it's like the door is out of its place in a way. I think it very enriching. How can we read productively the sort of indirect politics that is implied, because we can go and sort of read what is clearly political in those even clearly what tries to trace the political map. But I think it's perhaps it's a great complement and could be something more enriching to go like you're doing and trying to capture all that narrative and that ideology and all that information that's behind those tropes, what is behind that language. And that would be my sort of the last part of my comment, and perhaps opening also a question is how, I mean, this is what I see is, and also quoting one of your quotes as Manila's as the center of Southeast Asia, and many times the idea of the center being mentioned. And in the last 10 or maybe 15 years, we have seen more and more, especially from our colleagues in history, sort of this rethinking of the Habsburg Empire as a sort of a polycentric monarchy, and sort of rethinking the way we conceive empires and trying to undo our 19th century scheme that we have that has clearly, a center within the empire and then the peripheries. And how for 16th, 17th century, especially under the Habsburgs, I think that later under the Bourbons, it becomes more and more centralized, but especially before, you see this sort of Mexican, for example, discovery of Manila, and you see how different hubs and centers coexist, and they sort of draw a network that is not necessarily what we would think that with, clearly, Madrid in its center, and no, it's completely, different and more complex and richer, and I think ultimately leads us to a reconceptualization of political structures and opening much more spaces for local agency and go-betweens really doing actual things in those days. So my sort of question would be to invite you to say something about how your work in a way is questioning our understanding of empires and structures of political power, monarchies in the early modern times.
Thank you so much, Paul, for those wonderful comments. Let me start by one that actually is already helping me a lot. The way you said that some of these metaphorics, right? Some of these metaphorical machinery that is put in place to talk about Manila and its relation to the rest of the world and to the rest of the monarchy are actually domestic imaginaries. And I think that's a wonderful way, or might potentially be a wonderful way of linking those two halves of this talk and of my project as it is looking, or this is taking shape right now, right? And it reminds me of other texts that I've been working on and that I've been researching. I can think of a very domestic text, very rare to, it's how can I explain it shortly? So it's a handbook written by a procurador or a administrator, right, of an Augustinian convent in Manila, the main Augustinian convent in Manila. So it's a handbook for other administrators on how you do things to run a convent. It's an incredibly domestic text, manuscript, fascinating one. And of course, one that it talks about, it does everything. It talks about precisely how you paint doors, which colors you use, how do you re-roof, after the rainy season. How do you deal with servants in the convent? Where can you find the cheapest wood in which time of the year? This kind of domesticity, right? And at the same time, it's an incredible window in this kind of heterogeneous, very heterogeneous Manila that I'm describing. So I'm going to stick to that concept of some of this metaphorical language on ways of troping Manila have to do with the domestic imaginary. I love that. Thank you. The comparison between Spain, yeah, I guess it's a matter of scale and degree, right? I can remember, for instance, the famous Japanese embassy to Spain in the early 17th century. That was a complete spectacle. That was written about so much. That was something unseen before, not seen before, right? In Spain. So it is. I guess it's a matter of degree. Manila certainly. And it would be hard to find some of those nations that are probably, it becomes part of a rhetoric catalog, right? It doesn't, not all of them need to be there. It's just a cumulative way of telling, but it's true that beyond this kind of celebratory discourse, right? Manila was that diverse, and and it's easy to find proof of that. So I guess in comparison with Spain, it would be just a matter of degree. Then a polycentric monarchy, a composite monarchy. Yes, of course, that's precisely Manila was producing this kind of hyperbolic discourse about its own centrality, precisely because it was such a peripheral place. And a place that was key, again, to articulate different parts of Spain's dominions and ambitions that were much more important than Manila itself. And Manila is a place that is always on the verge of falling. No one wanted to go to Manila. Soldiers to Manila were forzados from New Spain. At some point, the colony becomes dependent on a situado, that is, it's not autonomous financially, it's not self-sufficient. It needs a yearly investment from New Spain. So it is truly, and I should have probably said that, it is a truly peripheral and precarious place in the political and military structures of the empire, and that's precisely, I think, why this discourse is so hyperbolically centralist, so to speak. So, but at the same time, it is true that, for instance, all that discourse about how you can see human diversity, not only in a map, as Sureka Davis has studied, because I saw her earlier around here, or not with that kind of kaleidoscopic gaze, but just going to the bridge one afternoon, right? And you'll see the world there in a kind of spectacular procession of heterogeneity, right? So that is, I think, as I said at some point, I think that is what is specific about this third new world. In other respects, is some of the cultural production of colonial Manila can be easily compared to colonial Latin American cultural production, right? But in this regard, I think that's what I'm most interested in, and a very lively street culture that, of course, is certainly not unique of Manila. You can think of Mexico or Lima, right? Or but I think the project is going in that direction. I'm complementing Rama's famous paradigm and all the critiques that have been in the last few years very productively applied to that paradigm, but also a much less known paradigm, but it will certainly be known for you, Flores Galindo's idea of the submerged city as opposed to the, or in complement with the letter city. And it was precisely a study of colonial Lima, right? And that metaphor of the submerged city, as after hearing this talk, you can imagine that has a lot to do with the kind of insularity or archipelagic imagination that is going on in these texts, the kind of plebeian fish, that humanizing of the natural world, and that. So that's where it's going, I believe, for now. And in that sense, it has increasingly, as I said, become more interested in these local aspects. I don't know if that answers all your, but thank you so much. That was incredibly.
Oh, fantastic! Beautiful. No, sure. I imagine that there are some other comments or questions from our colleagues here, or.
So yeah, thank you, Professor Firabas and Professor Martínez, for that discussion. We do want to open up more to Q&A. We have about 20 minutes. We have two related questions in the chat. One of Eric Beverly, he had to leave, but he is planning to follow up and listen to the answer. And then we have the second follow-up question that's related. So maybe we should go straight ahead with those two, and then anybody else who wants to ask a question, feel free to just use the raise hand function or type in the chat. Should I, Sophie, should I read the questions, or what? Are we nodding? Should I go ahead and read?
Yes, you can read the questions, and then I'll also have a question following up on what Paul said and what Eric is saying in one of in his question in the chat.
Sophie, do you want to ask your question after I read, or should we let Miguel respond?
I'm sorry. You can
okay.
Read the question. Yes, read the question and then I'll ask mine.
Okay, so this is from Eric Beverly, who's a professor in the history department, and he says, as someone who has done some work on representations of urban diversity myself, I am struck by how similar, almost standard generic, these types of descriptions are for many places across the early modern Indian Ocean. Here, creo que no hay en el mundo una ciudad, tantas naciones. How rich are these descriptions of specific groups, such as Persians, Bengalis, Chinese, Armenians, French, etc.? I'm wondering if there may, in some cases, in fact, be stock early modern, late medieval descriptions of urban anthropo diversity. Mm-hmm. And then the follow-up question from Sol Lee, is it related to Eric Beverly's question? It is intriguing to see these lists that include both regional nominations, Asians, Africans, and more particular designations, Chinese, Japanese. How do writers in the 17th, 18th centuries make sense of scale and categorization of diversity?
That's a great question, it's language.
Thank you, Rosa. That's a great question. And I think I already hinted at it. Some of, precisely the rhetorical nature of these catalogs, I think tells us, right, that, I mean, I think I bored you with so many catalogs that look like each other so much. And of course, I didn't pay attention to the detail of which nations or continents or origins are mentioned, because that's so not the point of that particular piece of text, right? If you go through that specificity, it is true. I mean, of course, there were Armenians in Manila, but there might have been two, right? Of course, the cultural work that they're doing, like factors, right? Like commercial agents, but the kind of cultural work that they're doing is a synecdoche, right? And a cumulative one of this collection or compendium of the whole world. So I think, I mean, I would love to talk more with Eric about the kind of work he's doing, but I do think that there's a level of conventionality and standardization and generic and rhetorical enthusiasm, right? And I actually, that also speaks to Sol Lee's point. Yes, it is completely, for our standards, it's completely, sometimes it looks like a Borgian, like a Borgian enumeration, the different categories, different scales, different levels, cities, islands, nations, ethnicities, and continents, right? That also tells us that the text becomes itself raptured by this rhetorical enthusiasm. Again, it's a kind of discourse that I haven't seen produced in other cities, much larger cities of the Spanish monarchy. So it is interesting, however rhetorical it is, that is precisely the trope or the discursive mechanism, right? A device that is used to represent Manila, to symbolize Manila. So some of those denominations, most of them I'm able to track them down, but some of them I'm in trouble to tell who they're referring to. And that is also part of my incompetence, but it also might imply that it's a kind of textual misreading, or they're taking it from somewhere else, or right, and changing it. So, and also my talk was very disorganized chronologically because it was more thematic. But that also changes with time. It's not the same, the Manila, of course, of 1600 than of 1740, which is the last text I commented, right? So yeah, I mean, I hope I can get in touch with Eric soon, and I thank him for his question, and same for Sol Lee.
Thank you. I kind of want to almost jump in with a question, but I don't know. I'll hand over to Sophie. She had the next one, and if there's time, I will come in with my own at some point.
Yes, I'd like to quickly interject to, first of all, well, thank Miguel, thank you very much for this great talk. As a literary scholar, I particularly appreciated the numerous primary sources, literary primary sources, and like you, I was struck by the relative or presumably homogeneity of the text, and I was not fooled either by the different categories and the repetition of the same categories, like you just said. They are very reminiscent of colonial discourse that I could have read in French literature, and I'm wondering if in the context of your work you were going to also perhaps look for a counter discourse. Were there any indigenous voices, if that were countering this colonial propaganda of sorts, because this representation of diversity seems absolutely marvelous and idyllic. I've also seen some engraving in the context of looking for illustration for your poster for this talk, with all these diverse nations or people being represented, strolling around on the streets happily. And I wonder if there are not just not imaginary representations, as you stated. Manila was indeed a very special case, but surely there must have been another side of that positive globalization, if you can say a word about it.
Thank you, Sophie. Of course. So this is as I try to say, right, this is entirely functional to and I guess it is very obvious for everyone, but I stress this because our contemporary discourses of diversity kind of might resemble at some point this kind of imperial discourse, and so that is a very important caution and very important, right, remark to take into account to what extent this kind of, and as I said, it is an orderly subjugated, conquered diversity, so to speak. And actually festivals, which I took some text from me, but I didn't talk about them as urban rituals, right, are very clear in that, because you see there people from all origins putting together dances or short plays in indigenous languages, or indigenous Tagalogs, for instance, putting together a dialogue in Latin. So you see, and that is all part of the same ritual of imperial power, of course, right? Are there indigenous voices in this kind of literary corpus and the literary culture of Manila? There are a few, not many. One of the texts I'm working on right now is by Thomas Pimpin, who was a printer and a writer of. He was a Tagalog from Manila, and he worked for the Dominicans. And he wrote a book that has been studied. It was an arte de la lengua for Tagalogs. It was for Tagalogs to learn Spanish, right? And this has been studied by Vicente Rafael and Damon Woods and other people. Well, not many other people, but as part of that book, Pimpin includes what I find fascinating poems that are songs. They are songs to learn. They're perfectly bilingual songs with one hemistic. I'm not saying this right. One half of the line, I forgot the name in English. Half of the line is in Tagalog and half of the line is in Spanish. I don't speak Tagalog. I don't read Tagalog. I have friends who help me with this, or the sources from the period, right, from the friars who worked on this. But it's a fascinating. They have been dismissed because it's basically lexical items, right, or small phrases, and they have been dismissed as nonsense. And there was this, and I compared them to this song that is famous, that might be for some English learners, Spanish-speaking English learners might be familiar. Pollito, chicken, gallina, hen, lápiz, pencil, y pluma, pen. It's that kind of song. So it has been dismissed as something that has no value. But if you actually look and pay attention to the kind of lexical items, to the registers that get included in it's a satire. It is a satire of colonial institutions in the city, And it is, and I go to your question, I hope this speaks to your question as well. And it is also a view from below on the liveliness and the kind of urban crowds that populate the city, with the mentions of the professions, etc. Right? And it's all crowned by one porquero, one swine herder, I guess, right? And the alcalde mayor, a judge. So in this list of mostly lexical items, that is incredibly Martinian, so to speak, right? I am trying to make an argument about how to read that diversity very differently, right? So there's that. There's you might be mentioning, you might be referring to this artist I mentioned, Cruz Bagay, who in the middle of the 18th century made these beautiful engravings that actually represent this diversity, but in these grids that accompany a map, and that is, you know, everyone in its own place. So I guess it's a very different representative strategy. And then some colleagues have worked on indigenous intellectuals who, for instance, used Latin, and of course, there's a lot of work on grammatical and linguistic production in the archipelago. So there's a little bit, but does that answer your questions?
Yes, it does, Miguel. Thank you very much.
Well, I forgot to mention, in addition to texts, the Philippines is an incredibly conflictuous and rebellious space. I mean, these Chinese that figure here, as you know, again, as an index of orderly diversity, they were brutally massacred when they rebelled several times during the 17th century. And it was very rapidly repopulated with people from China, so with merchants mostly. But I mean, anti-colonial rebellions exploded in Pangasinan. Mindanao was never conquered, so it was an incredibly conflicted and rebellious.
I couldn't help but think of Haiti because of the current events, and you know how Saint-Domingue, when, as it was called, was described in such idyllic terms, not globalization terms, but idyllic terms, and we know what happened.
Right, of
Okay,
course.
thank you, Miguel. I think that we have one more question that perhaps we can deal with. Rosie?
We have Linda Wicks in the chat. You mentioned that the city showed social hierarchy. How did the Filipinos fit in? Did they fit into the bottom class? Were they the slaves? Just who were the slaves? Do we know anything about the lower class?
Okay, thank you, Linda. Filipinos, well, Filipinos is a modern denomination, right? That encompasses many different languages and ethnicities. Manila and its surrounding area is mostly Tagalog, or was mostly Tagalog, but the city was populated with people from many other parts of the Philippines, Ilocanos, Pangasinan, people from Mindoro, etc. Right? So and of course, in any other colonial scenario, they were not enslaved because they were considered naturales, and of course they were protected by the no me sale ahora, las leyes de Indias, no me sale en inglés. But of course there were many slaves in the Philippines, and they were not only Black Africans, but also people from India who got there are incredibly complicated slave trading networks in the Indian Ocean that end up connecting with Manila. There's also an interesting phenomenon because the issue of indigenous slavery is more complicated in the Philippines, in the Philippines than in the Americas, for instance, because there was slavery was an institution that was very much part of crucial social structures and relations in the Philippines before the Spanish arrived, and it was a way of paying debt, and you could have a slave who at the same time had a slave, and so it was a very different. And this has been studied by ethnohistorians and by anthropologists, right? right? But that added a layer of complexity to the issue of indigenous slavery in the Philippines. Let me see if I more or less answered the question. Yes, well, there are other interesting documents which, you know, in any other colonial context will be of use for my work, for work such as mine. I mean, there's interesting trials, both, you know, ecclesiastical and civil, that provide a glimpse into the more into this kind of popular culture. I guess the question that's where it's headed. I've been working on really interesting inquisitorial materials which are housed in Mexico's Archivo General de la Nación, because of course the Philippines were part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So that's where the inquisitorial archives are. And there's some really interesting work done on very early inquisitorial cases. And of course, that is always a window to see the same way inquisitorial archives have been used in the Iberian Peninsula, right, to reconstruct the cultures, the culture, the lives, and the social relations of these bottom classes, as Linda says, right?
Thank you, Miguel. So we'll just very briefly address the last question from Rita Nazami, who says, you described Manila as a perfect collection of the entire world, including Bengalis and others. You also mentioned languages, including Sanskrit. With the presence of so many cultures and languages, what kind of influence did this global presence have on the local culture and language? Is it still evident today? So if we just take a couple of minutes to answer that, and then we'll close up. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. I don't think I mentioned Sanskrit. That was probably a mispronunciation of something else. But no, I'm not aware of Sanskrit in the textual legacies of the colonial Philippines. But there is indeed an important presence of Chinese and a little bit of Japanese. Tagalog, of course, in certain kinds of documents and in certain kind of texts. One of the miscellanies I shared with you, I didn't share the images because I feel that I've already shared those too much. But in that miscellany, by Diego de Rueda, there's actually a couple of poems in Chinese. There's a blank page that was supposed to hold a Japanese translation of a Virgilian eclogue, but I guess the calligrapher was not available that day, and so the page is blank. There's texts in Tagalog, there's texts in Latin, there's text in Portuguese, and in Mock Basque, which was a way of was a kind of stock literary language in early modern Spain to mock Basque speakers who cannot make, who speak broken Spanish, so to speak, but it's a stock literary idiom, right? So it is quite diverse linguistically, and the other languages of the Philippines are mostly Bisaya or Cebuano today, are also represented in this vast textual corpus, of course, and other languages. But no, I'm sorry if I mispronounced something that sounded like Sanskrit, but I'm not aware of any text in Sanskrit in the Philippines. I might be wrong.
Actually, that made a lot of sense to me because Bengali people do speak Bangla, which is derived from Sanskrit. So we are talking about the 18th century, and so maybe Bengali sounded very different at that time.
Bengalis are actually normally appear as slaves in text from the Philippines.
Oh, really? Oh, that's very interesting to know.
I don't have it at my, I don't have it at hand right now, but if you're interested, I can get some, scholarship of people who actually have worked on slave trade in Manila. I'm thinking the first thing that comes to mind is by Tatiana Seijas, who has a book on Asian slavery in colonial Mexico, but she also speaks about the slave trade in Manila and the Philippines. And there's more, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Do you know if they were Bengalis from East Bengal or West Bengal?
I wouldn't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the information and your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. This Q&A was extremely rich and definitely helped me put the talk more into perspective, especially this issue of, I'll just take the liberty to speak for a minute because I'm overflowing with ideas. Especially the issue of Manila is actually on the periphery. And so it's fascinating that maybe all of this language and the hyperboles are being used to somehow, like you said, create and control what the world is. And there's more I could say. This is exciting stuff. I feel like we could have talked more about the shift from the global to the local. I had written some notes on that because I wasn't sure. To me, it didn't really seem like a shift. It seemed like just a different perspective, but actually the content was more or less the same, which is interesting, right? Because it shows the global and the local maybe are not disconnected. It's two ways of looking at the same thing. I'm actually a philosopher, so I love this stuff of different ways of looking at the same thing. And so anyway, I'll stop talking there. I just want to thank everybody for this event. I want to thank our speaker hugely. I want to thank our discussant, for all of the attendees. For those who couldn't stay for the full Q&A, we will be uploading this online. And with that, I hand over to the director of our institute to close up.
Well, thank you very much, Rosie. Well said. To conclude or to wrap up this talk, making that connection between the global and the local, it was very explicitly shown in this talk. So thank you, Miguel Martínez, for visiting us today at the Institute. And thanks to our great audience for attending, asking all these great questions. A special thanks to my colleague from the Department of Hispanic Language and Literature for co-moderating this event with Rosabel, Dr. Paul Fairbass. We love our partnership with Hispanics around globalization issues, as we do love our partnership with all the different departments of the College of Arts and Sciences. In a couple of days, you'll receive the recording for this event. You feel free to share it with anyone else who might be interested. We look forward to hosting you all again next month in our lecture series for the third event of globalization across time and space. I want to thank our graduate assistant Lance, who has been so good at putting all the information on the chat box as we are speaking. So the event will be hosting Dr. Manaklia, Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University. From Columbia University on November 5th. It's a Friday. This time it's at 3 p.m., not 1 p.m., but same place. It'll be on Zoom. Everybody who attended this event or registered for it will receive an invitation. The title of her talk is Trans-Regional Ties That Bind Men of Power and Men of Learning Across Early Modern Persianate Asia. Goodbye for now, and until next month.